Sup, I'm Q, and this is the newest addition to my shop. You know, sometimes you play the thrift store lottery and you lose, and other times you find a vintage router table for only 30 bucks. But this thing is really only a deal if I can fit the router that I already have into it, so fingers crossed here.
So my gamble paid off. The holes on my router just so happened to be perfectly aligned with the holes on this tabletop, except for one. But it's on there pretty tight. I'm not worried about it. As much as I like this whole stand, and as much as I like the idea of this being its own independent tool from everything else, I don't really have a place for this to live anywhere without doing a major shop remodel, so I think I'm gonna have to go back to plan A.
Plan A being to mount this thing in the wing of my table saw, so let's get started. First things first, we need to get measurements for the table and the place where the table is going.
24 by 14 and an eighth. 27, about 17, all the way to the end.
That leaves us with just over a 3-inch gap in both dimensions, which means that if we try to put the router table in right now, it's just gonna float there and fall out. So we're gonna need to build some kind of border around the router table to fill out that empty space.
I have these two rails left over from building my workbench, and if I mill them down just a little bit more, I can get them to be the perfect width to make up for the difference between the width of the router table and the width of the table saw. I've been staring at this for like a week. Let's go ahead and do it.
Since the dimension I'm trying to fill here is about 3 1/16, I'm gonna try to mill these boards down to be 1 17/32 square. That way, when you add them together on both sides of the router table, that should give us that additional 3 1/16 extra length and width. Now that we have those boards to the right dimensions, I can set a stop block on my miter saw to be the exact width of my router table, then cut 2 boards to that size. The first cut on each of these boards is just to establish a square edge, and then I bring them to length on the second cut. Now I adjust my stop block to be the exact length of the router table plus those 2 blocks that we just cut. And just like that, we have a border done. But now we need to find a way to join it together. There are lots of different methods you could use. You could dowel this together. You could even use a domino if you are crazy. But I'm choosing to use pocket holes on this, mainly because I want to get this done quick and I don't really care how it looks. And before we join our border together, I need to cut a groove out for that miter slot so that if I ever want to use a miter gauge on this, I still can. First, I'm going to butt it up here and mark the section that I need to take out. Then I can go over to my table saw and set the blade height to be about the same as the depth of that miter gauge. Then I can cut out that notch on the table saw. I start by establishing both ends of the cut first, and then I can quickly hog out all of the material in the middle. Now that's looking pretty nice. For the next step, we're gonna need to really start thinking about how this thing is actually going to attach to the table saw. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove this bar on the end of the fence. And that revealed this little T-track that I can slide some hex bolts into. Now we just need to find a way to get these bolts onto the router table, because if we just try to set the router table on top like this, it's obviously gonna leave it pretty proud of the table saw. So we're going to need to modify the router table ever so slightly. I'm using a drill bit that's slightly bigger than those bolts and putting 3 holes in the side. Then I can grab my little file and bring those holes all the way down, so instead of a hole I have more of a notch that I could slide those bolts in from above. We're going to need those notches on our border as well, so I put the border piece in place and marked those locations. Then I could take it over to the drill press and start the holes just like before. The drill press is just to ensure that my holes are as straight as I can possibly get them, but you could also do this with a hand drill. And to clear out the rest of the material, I just took it over to the bandsaw. And this is the first time I've gotten to use my bandsaw in a project like this. I was really excited. But you could also do this with a table saw. And now I think we're finally ready for assembly. I'm going to use both glue and the pocket hole screws to assemble this. And since we're gluing on end grain, I'm going to put a little bit of glue on all of the end grain and let that sit for about 10 minutes. Then I'm going to come back and put more glue on all of the joints. This is because end grain likes to soak up glue really fast, and if you do it this way, it tends to hold a little bit better. Now that we've got the pocket screws in, that aluminum router table is friction fit really well, but I would really prefer more than friction to be holding this in place. So I pre-drilled and then installed a bunch of screws on the back. And I know I said I don't care how these pocket holes look, but I went ahead and plugged them because I don't want dust to build up in there. I haven't actually mentioned it yet, but this border is made of white oak and that dowel is actually red oak, so they're going to be a little off color when this is all finished. I gave the thing a light sanding, and afterwards I could apply some tung oil so that it would match the finish on my workbench. And now that our border's attached, we can go ahead and fit this in place and see what it looks like. Now, finally, we're going to need to secure the table from the back as well, so I'm going to measure and mark out 3 evenly spaced locations for bolt holes. Then I'm going to use the same drill bit from before to start a hole at each of those locations. Once they're started, I'm going to switch over to the big drill bit. With the bigger hole established on one side, I just now need to punch through with that smaller drill bit on all 3 holes. Then we can try to level off the top and slide in some washers on the back for those bolts. The washers on the back were pretty finicky, but it was actually the front ones that were giving me more trouble.
It keeps wanting to shift right there.
Due to the offset in height from the border and the actual router table, those washers kept wanting to shift in place and couldn't really get a good grip. So here's my fix. I took a 4th washer and I cut that into 3 separate pieces. And then I glued each one of those pieces to the bottom of those washers to try to make up for the difference in height. And with that extra little offset on the bottom, these washers were able to lock right in place and hold the router table right where it needed to be. Now let's give it a test run.
Well, I've got it in place. I've gotten to use it a few times, and I can say that this is pretty solid and it's not going anywhere. There was a time there where about a year ago, I was thinking the only 3 major tools I was missing were a drill press, a bandsaw, and a router table. And with the addition of this, I now feel like there are very few things that I can't do in this shop now. As you can see, I have built out a little cabinet underneath it. I think that's a really efficient use of space. And if you want to see the whole build process and how I built out this cabinet, I'll have a video about that very soon coming out. So subscribe to the channel to check that out. Overall, the main thing I would absolutely recommend is if you are going to do this, you really need at least some kind of legs on this side, because before this cabinet was in place, whenever I would press down on the edge of this aluminum frame, it would have a lot of give and bend to it, and you really don't want that when you have a big spinning ball of death a few inches away from your fingers. And the other main thing is mine did not come with its own built-in power switch, so I would have to reach under here and flip the switch on the router itself in order to actually use that. So this purchase of the little power switch I have here was an absolute must, because in case of an emergency, you really don't want to have to reach under your tool to power it off. Overall, I'm really enjoying it, and I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you enjoyed the build, and we'll see you next time.